Daniel was the kind of boy who never wanted to stand in the center of attention. He liked being quiet, liked keeping to himself, and often sat in the back of the classroom. He wasn't poor, but his clothes were never the newest or the fanciest. While others wore brand-name sneakers, he wore plain shoes that had seen better days. While some carried expensive bags, he carried a simple, worn-out backpack that his mother had patched up more than once. To him, none of this mattered. What mattered was learning, drawing in his notebook, and getting through each day without trouble. But to the bullies at school, Daniel was an easy target. They saw his quiet nature as weakness. They saw his silence as permission. And so, day after day, they picked at him the way wolves test the smallest member of the herd. At first, it was small things, mocking the way he spoke, teasing the way he wore his hair, laughing when his shoes squeaked on the polished school floor. But soon, the teasing grew louder, crueler, bolder. In the hallway, one boy nudged his friend and pointed at Daniel. "Look at his backpack. Looks like it came from the trash." The others laughed, a cruel sound that echoed against the lockers. Daniel heard them, of course, but he kept walking, pretending he didn't care. Inside, his stomach twisted, but on the outside, he stayed calm. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave bullies more power. The bullies, however, wanted reactions. They thrived on the laughter of others, the kind that made them feel strong and important. One of them, a tall boy named Mark, often led the pack. Mark's laughter was the loudest, his voice the sharpest, his insults the cruelest. He seemed to enjoy Daniel's silence the most, as if it were a challenge he wanted to break. "Hey, quiet boy," he would shout across the hall. "Did your mom sew that shirt herself? Looks like it's falling apart." His friends roared with laughter as Daniel adjusted his collar and kept walking. Eyes fixed on the floor, every insult chipped away at him, but Daniel refused to let them see it. His mother always told him, "Silence can be strength, Daniel. You don't have to fight every battle with words or fists. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing." He believed her. But he also felt the heavy weight of being alone, of being mocked while others stood around and watched. In the classroom, things weren't much better. Whenever Daniel raised his hand to answer a question, the bullies would whisper loudly, mocking his voice. Listen to him trying to sound smart. They'd snicker. Sometimes they would throw paper balls at his desk when the teacher wasn't looking. Daniel pretended not to notice, but the sting in his chest was impossible to ignore. He wondered why the teachers never saw, or maybe they saw but didn't want to interfere. Lunchtime was the hardest. The cafeteria was a stage for cruelty, and the bullies loved performing there. Daniel always sat alone at the far end of a table, eating quietly, trying to finish quickly so he could escape the noise. But the bullies would often spot him. "There he is." One of them would shout, walking over with a tray full of food. "What's for lunch, Danny boy?" Air and sadness. The group burst out laughing again. Sometimes they would pass by and bump into him on purpose, spilling his drink or knocking his fork onto the floor. Daniel would quietly pick it up, wipe it clean, and continue eating, all while pretending. He didn't hear their laughter ringing in his ears. What hurt most wasn't even the bullies, it was the silence of everyone else. The classmates who sat nearby, the ones who saw what was happening, never spoke up. They looked away, afraid to draw the bullies' attention to themselves. Some even giggled nervously, not because they wanted to hurt Daniel, but because they didn't want to become the next target. That silence felt heavier than the insults, like the whole world had agreed he was invisible. But Daniel wasn't as fragile as they thought. Every night, he wrote in his notebook, pouring out his feelings in words and sketches. He drew pictures of heroes who stood tall against enemies, warriors who fought not with swords, but with courage. He imagined himself as one of them, strong and unshaken. It was his secret world, the place where he was more than just the quiet kid. Still, each morning when he put on his worn-out shoes and stepped into the school, he braced himself for another day of laughter at his expense. The bullies seemed determined to break him, to strip away his dignity piece by piece. And though Daniel held his silence like a shield, even shields can grow heavy when the blows keep coming. On the outside, the bullies saw only a boy they could push around without consequences. To them, Daniel was nothing but a quiet shadow, someone too weak to fight back, too timid to speak up. But deep down, behind his silence, Daniel carried something they didn't know, a truth that would one day stop their laughter cold. For now, though the mockery continued, every hallway, every classroom, every lunch break was another test of endurance. The bullies laughed louder, pushed harder, mocked crueler. And all the while, Daniel kept walking, his silence hiding not fear, but something else. Something the bullies would only discover too late. Asterisk, it was a normal afternoon in the cafeteria, at least for everyone else. The chatter of voices, the clatter of trays, and the smell of fried food filled the air. Students crowded around tables, laughing, trading snacks, and talking about weekend plans. For Daniel, it was just another battle he had to survive quietly. He walked to the corner of the room with his small tray, holding a sandwich and a carton of milk, and sat down at the edge of a long table. He always chose the farthest spot, hoping no one would notice him. But the bullies always noticed. Mark spotted him first, his grin spreading as if he had just seen prey waiting to be hunted. "There's our quiet little friend," he whispered to his buddies, his eyes glittering with mischief. The others turned and laughed, already sensing what was coming. They carried their trays like weapons and marched toward Daniel's table, loud enough for half the cafeteria to notice. Daniel kept his head down, staring at his sandwich as though it could protect him. He prayed they would pass him by, but the bullies never passed, they always stopped. Mark slammed his tray on the table, making Daniel flinch. "What's for lunch today, Danny boy?" "Oh wait, who would want to share a table with you?" His voice carried across the cafeteria, and laughter erupted. Another boy grabbed Daniel's milk carton and shook it before slamming it back down, splashing milk onto the table and Daniel's shirt. "Oops," he said, pretending it was an accident. "Guess you're wearing your lunch today." The whole table laughed. Some kids at nearby tables turned their heads quickly, pretending not to see, while others watched with guilty smiles, too afraid to intervene. Daniel's face burned red, but he stayed quiet. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Silence can be strength, Daniel. Don't give them what they want." But the bullies weren't satisfied with silence anymore. They wanted the crowd to laugh, to see Daniel humiliated. Mark leaned down close to his ear and whispered, "You think staying quiet makes you strong? It makes you pathetic." Then, before Daniel could react, Mark swiped the sandwich from his tray and tossed it across the room. It landed with a slap on the floor, mayonnaise splattering. The cafeteria roared with laughter. Daniel's stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from shame. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, watching, judging, waiting to see what he would do. His hands clenched under the table, nails digging into his palms. But still, he said nothing. Mark wasn't done. "Look at him," he shouted to the crowd. "He won't even fight back. He's just a scared little mouse." With that, he pushed Daniel's tray off the table. The crash echoed as the plates shattered on the floor, food scattering across the tiles. The laughter grew louder. Crueler. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the mess. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might cry, but he refused to let them see tears. Slowly, he bent down, picking up the broken pieces of his tray, piece by piece. As the bullies laughed above him, somewhere in the cafeteria, a teacher's voice shouted, "What's going on here?" The bullies quickly straightened up, their smirks fading as they pretended to be innocent. But everyone had already seen what happened. They had seen Daniel humiliated in front of the entire school. As Daniel stood up, holding the broken tray in his hands, his eyes met the crowd. For the first time, he looked at them not with shame, but with something else. His gaze was sharp, steady, almost haunting. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something the bullies couldn't quite name. For a brief second, even Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. Daniel walked toward the trash bin, dropped the pieces inside, and quietly left the cafeteria without saying a single word. The room buzzed with whispers after he was gone. Some felt pity, some felt guilt, but the bullies only laughed again, trying to shake off the strange feeling that Daniel's silence had left behind. But deep down, everyone had noticed it the way his eyes had locked on them, calm and unblinking, as if he carried a secret they didn't know. A secret that made their cruelty seem smaller, weaker. They didn't understand it yet, but that moment in the cafeteria was not the end. It was the beginning. Daniel's humiliation was supposed to make him look powerless, but instead it planted unease in the hearts of everyone watching. The bullies had wanted a spectacle, and they got one, but not in the way they had planned. Because behind Daniel's silence was a frightening truth they would soon be forced to face. The cafeteria incident spread like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in school had heard about how Daniel was humiliated in front of the crowd. Some laughed as they retold the story, exaggerating the details, while others repeated it in hushed voices, feeling uneasy about the way Daniel had stared at everyone before walking out. His silence had not been ordinary yet, carried a strange weight, and people couldn't stop thinking about it. In the classrooms, whispers began to drift between desks. Why doesn't he fight back? One student asked. Maybe he's scared. But another shook his head. No, it didn't look like fear. It was different. Did you see his eyes? That question repeated again and again. Did you see his eyes? Even some teachers noticed something about Daniel that day. He was quiet, as always, but he carried himself differently. He didn't slouch in his seat like a boy defeated. Instead, he sat tall, writing in his notebook with a calm focus that felt strange after what he had endured. When the bullies passed by his desk and sneered, he didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. That stillness made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. By lunchtime, rumors had started. Someone claimed Daniel wasn't just quiet, he was hiding something. One girl said her cousin had seen him at the hospital more than once. Another whispered that his family had secrets, that he was stronger than he looked, maybe even dangerous. The rumors were wild, unproven, and sometimes ridiculous. But they spread like smoke in the wind. The bullies themselves felt the tension. Mark, who usually laughed the loudest, found himself thinking about the way Daniel's eyes had locked on him in the cafeteria. He didn't admit it to his friends, of course. Instead, he doubled his jokes, acting as if nothing had changed. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, Daniel wasn't as powerless as he seemed. During gym class, the whispers grew louder. As the boys lined up to play basketball, some students nudged each other and pointed toward Daniel. He never plays. Ever notice that? He always sits out. Another student frowned. What if he can't? What if there's something wrong with him? That caught attention. The more people thought about it, the more they realized it was true. Daniel always avoided physical activities. He walked slowly during warm-ups, sat quietly during rough games, and the coaches never seemed to push him. Maybe that's his secret, someone whispered. Maybe he has some kind of condition. The word condition spread quickly, and with it, curiosity. Some kids began to feel guilty. If Daniel was sick or fragile, then the bullying was worse than cruel. It was dangerous. Others, however, leaned into fear. The idea of someone holding back, staying silent while hiding something frightening, made their imaginations run wild that day. As Daniel walked home, he noticed the stares. Children who once ignored him now looked at him differently. Some looked away quickly, ashamed, while others stared as if trying to solve a puzzle. He could hear fragments of conversation behind him, his name spoken in whispers, followed by half-finished sentences and uneasy laughter. At home. Daniel sat at his small desk by the window, notebook open in front of him. He drew quietly, sketching the faces of the bullies, then turning them into monstrous figures in his art shadows with cruel eyes and sharp teeth. But next to them, he always drew a hero, silent but strong, standing against the darkness. It was his way of releasing the storm inside him. His mother entered the room, noticing the heaviness in his expression. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Rough day again?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded but said nothing. She looked at his sketches and sighed. "People don't understand what they fear, Daniel, but one day they will. And when they do, they'll wish they had treated you differently." Her words comforted him, but they also made him wonder, what would happen when they finally learned the truth? He had lived with his condition for years, keeping it hidden, surviving quietly while carrying the weight of danger inside him. He never wanted anyone to know. But now, after the cafeteria humiliation, after the whispers spreading like wildfire, he realized it was only a matter of time before the secret surfaced. The bullies still laughed in the hallways. But something had shifted. Their laughter was forced, too loud, as if covering up unease. And every time Daniel walked past, silent and calm, their stomachs tightened with a fear they didn't want to admit. For the rest of the school, the whispers continued to grow. Was Daniel weak? Or was he hiding a strength that could shatter them all? Nobody knew for sure. But one thing was certain. Daniel was no longer just the quiet boy in the corner. He had become a mystery. And sometimes, a mystery is far more frightening than anything people can see with their own eyes. Asterisk. The tension around Daniel grew heavier with each passing day. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had only spread wider. Some students avoided him now, afraid of what he might be hiding. Others stared with guilty curiosity, wanting to know if the rumors were true. But the bullies, they weren't ready to stop. If anything, the unease in the air made them more determined to prove they still controlled him. Mark, the leader, felt it more than anyone. He remembered the way Daniel's eyes had met his in the cafeteria, calm and unshaken, almost daring him without words. That stare replayed in his mind late at night, though he'd never admit it. He told himself Daniel was nothing, just a quiet, fragile boy. Yet a part of him wanted to crush whatever dignity Daniel still carried. That was how bullies worked. If silence felt like defiance, they needed to break it. It happened on a gray morning when the sky hung heavy with clouds. Students moved through the hallways, restless, waiting for the first bell. Daniel was at his locker, carefully placing his books inside, when Mark and his crew closed in. Their voices were loud, sharp, and cruel enough to draw a small crowd. "Well, it isn't the mystery boy," Mark sneered. "Still too good to talk to us?" Daniel didn't answer. He adjusted his books quietly, his back straight, his face calm. That silence was unbearable for Mark. "You think you're better than us? You think those weird stares make you special?" His words echoed off the lockers, drawing more students closer. Before Daniel could step away, another bully yanked the strap of his backpack, pulling it off his shoulder. The bag hit the ground, and notebooks spilled across the floor. Papers fluttered like fallen leaves, scattering in every direction. The bullies laughed, kicking at the pages as if they were trash. Daniel bent down quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his papers. But Mark wasn't finished. He picked up Daniel's sketchbook and held it high. "What's this?" Your diary. He flipped it open, and crude laughter erupted. Look, guys, he draws little cartoons. Heroes and monsters. The bullies passed the sketchbook around, mocking each drawing. This is him, right? Hiding behind make-believe. One jeered. Daniel's chest tightened. Those drawings were his refuge, his private world. Having them displayed like this felt like being stripped bare in front of everyone. Still, he kept silent, his jaw clenched. His eyes locked on the floor, but then something else slipped from the bag, a small laminated card, tucked between pages of notes. One of the bullies bent down, curious, and picked it up. His laughter stopped. He squinted at the words on the card, his face draining of color. What is it? Mark asked impatiently, snatching it from his hand. His grin faltered as he read aloud. Patient, Daniel Hayes. Congenital heart condition. Avoid stress, avoid physical impact, risk of cardiac failure. His voice trailed off. The crowd went silent. The laughter that had filled the hallway evaporated into the still air. Every eye turned to Daniel, who stood frozen, his hands still clutching scattered papers. The words hung heavy. It's more powerful than any punch or shout could have been. The bullies stared at the card, realization hitting them all at once. Every insult, every shove, every cruel Joe Kenny, one of them could have triggered something far more serious than they ever imagined. Their cruelty had not just been mean, it had been life-threatening. Mark's hand shook slightly as he lowered the card. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. The boys behind him shifted uncomfortably, their smirks gone, replaced with a sick, uneasy guilt. Daniel slowly rose, his face pale but steady. He didn't reach for the card. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. His eyes met theirs, calm, unblinking, carrying a truth they could no longer deny. The hallway buzzed with whispers again, but this time they weren't mocking. Did you hear? He's sick. He has a heart condition. All this time, and they were pushing him like that. The murmurs carried anger, pity, and shock all at once. Some students looked at the bullies with disgust, others with fear. Daniel bent down, gathered the last of his papers, and walked away. He didn't run, didn't cry, didn't even glance back. His steps were slow but steady, each one heavier with the weight of the truth now exposed. The bullies remained frozen by the lockers, the cards still trembling in Mark's hand. For the first time, they weren't laughing. They weren't powerful. They weren't in control. Instead, they were left staring at the frightening truth. Their cruelty could have killed him. The crowd slowly dispersed, whispers trailing after Daniel as he disappeared down the hall. Students who had once looked away now looked at him with something near respect, guilt, and a dawning understanding that the boy they had ignored was far stronger than they had ever known. And for the bullies, the breaking point had arrived. They had pushed too far, and the truth had broken them instead. The discovery of the card changed everything. What was once a story about a quiet boy being mocked had now turned into something far darker. The bullies had always thought Daniel was harmless, someone who could endure their insults without consequence. But now they understood that every cruel shove, every harsh laugh, every accident could have ended in something they would never be able to take back. That realization spread quickly, not just among the bullies, but through the entire school. By the next day, Daniel was no longer just the silent boy in the corner. He had become the center of whispers that carried both fear and guilt. Students gathered in clusters between classes, repeating what they had heard. He has a heart condition. Dangerous. Stress could hurt him. Some spoke with sympathy, while others whispered with awe, as though Daniel carried a hidden power. The truth frightened them not because Daniel was dangerous, but because the bullies had been so close to crossing a line none of them had even imagined. Even teachers began to notice the change. The principal called Daniel into the office, his voice softer than usual. "Why didn't you tell us, son? You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Daniel only shrugged. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be treated differently. He had lived this way for years, quietly carrying his burden. But now that the truth was out, there was no going back. For the bullies, the fear was personal. Mark couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of the words he had read on that card. Risk of cardiac failure. His hands had shoved Daniel into lockers. His laughter had followed him down hallways. His taunts had been louder than anyone's. If something had happened, Diff Daniel had collapsed because of him. What then? That thought crawled into his chest and sat there like a weight he couldn't lift. The next morning, when Mark saw Daniel walking into school, he didn't laugh. He didn't shove him. He didn't even make eye contact. His friends felt the same. The group that had once marched proudly through the halls, mocking whoever they pleased, now walked quieter, their voices low, their steps hesitant. They felt the stares of the other students, who no longer saw them as powerful but as cruel cowards who had come close to breaking something fragile beyond repair. The frightening truth wasn't just about Daniel's condition, was about themselves. They realized that they had been monsters without even knowing it. Every joke, every laugh, every humiliation now felt heavier, darker. Their cruelty had been easy when they thought Daniel was just quiet. But knowing that their cruelty could have killed him, that knowledge made their laughter curdle into guilt. Daniel, meanwhile, continued his routine. He walked into class with his books, sat down at his desk, and opened his notebook. His silence hadn't changed, but the way others saw it had. Where once they saw weakness, now they saw strength. The boy who carried such a dangerous condition, yet never once complained, never once begged for mercy, never once shouted back, that was no weak boy. That was someone with more control, more courage than anyone else in the room. Some students began treating him differently. A few offered him seats, others asked if he needed help carrying things. He would smile politely and shake his head. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be treated like glass. What he wanted was respect, and slowly, silently, he was earning it. The bullies, however, couldn't escape. The truth followed them everywhere. When they sat in the cafeteria, other students stared. When they walked down the hallway, people whispered. They were no longer feared. They were despised. And worse than that, they were reminded constantly of the boy they had tried to break, who instead had broken them with nothing but silence and truth. Mark found himself remembering every moment he had mocked Daniel's clothes, his voice, his drawings. He remembered the cafeteria where he had thrown Daniel's sandwich to the floor. Now, every one of those memories twisted into shame. He saw Daniel differently, now not as prey, but as someone stronger than he could ever be. The truth frightened him not because of what Daniel might do, but because of what it revealed about himself. He was the monster in the story, and Daniel was the one who had endured. Quietly, patiently, carrying a secret that could have ended everything by the end of the week. The entire school had changed. The laughter had stopped. The mocking had ended. Everywhere Daniel walked, silence followed, not the cruel silence of being ignored, but the heavy silence of respect, guilt, and fear. He didn't need to speak. The truth had spoken for him, and in that silence, the bullies finally understood. Their cruelty had been built on lies, but the truth had torn it apart. They had wanted to break him. Instead, they had been broken by the frightening reality that their actions carried consequences far darker than they were. Ready to face? The news spread faster than anyone expected. What had started as whispers in the hallways became a story that carried through classrooms, across lunch tables, and even into the homes of students. Parents heard it from their children, Teachers overheard it in staff rooms, and by the end of the week, Daniel's secret was no longer a secret at all. Everyone knew it wasn't just that Daniel had a heart condition. It was the realization of what that meant. Every cruel word, every shove, every prank the bullies had pulled on him, it all could have turned deadly. The thought alone sent a ripple of guilt through the school. Students who had laughed along now stayed silent. Those who had looked away when Daniel was mocked now avoided the bullies completely. The power balance had shifted, and everyone felt it. In the classrooms, Daniel's presence carried a new weight. He didn't speak more than before, didn't act differently. Yet every time he raised his hand or walked to sharpen his pencil, the room grew quieter. His classmates watched him, not with mockery now, but with something close to reverence. He had endured years of cruelty and silence, and now that silence felt unshakable. Like a shield no one could penetrate. The teachers, too, began to watch more closely. They gave Daniel small nods of approval, subtle signs of support. Some even looked ashamed, as if realizing they had missed what was happening right under their noses. The truth had forced everyone to see him differently, not as the weak boy in the corner, but as someone who carried a burden no child should ever have to carry. The bullies, once loud and proud, found themselves shrinking. In the cafeteria, their table was emptier than ever. Students who used to laugh at their jokes no longer joined them. Instead, they sat far away, their faces cold with disapproval. The bullies tried to act as if nothing had changed, but their voices were quieter now, their laughter forced. Every time they looked across the room and saw Daniel sitting with his calm expression, eating his meal in silence, they felt a knot tighten in their chests. Mark especially felt the weight. For years, he had walked through the school like he owned it. But now, he couldn't walk 10 steps without feeling the eyes of others on him. He heard the whispers, "That's the one who mocked Daniel. That's the one who nearly pushed him too far." The words clung to him like shadows, following him wherever he went. At home, parents asked their kids about the story. Some were horrified that such cruelty had been allowed to go so far. Others told their children to be kinder, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. For Daniel, who had always lived in quiet isolation, it was strange to know that his name was being spoken in living rooms and kitchens across the town. Yet, Daniel himself remained the same. He didn't seek attention, didn't chase sympathy, and didn't lash out at anyone. He continued to sketch in his notebook, continued to answer questions in class when asked, and continued to walk with his calm, steady silence. That silence was louder now than it had ever been. It spoke of strength, of dignity, of survival. And the more people saw it, the more they respected him. The shockwave of truth had done something the bullies never intended it had made Daniel visible. For years, they had tried to erase him with their cruelty, to make him small, to push him into the shadows. But now, their cruelty had backfired. Instead of being invisible, Daniel had become unforgettable. Students who had once ignored him now greeted him softly in the hallways. Some asked if he wanted to sit with them at lunch. Daniel rarely accepted, still preferring his quiet space, but he noticed the difference. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. People finally saw him for who he was, someone who had endured more than any of them ever realized. The bullies, meanwhile, were crumbling under the weight of their guilt. Their confidence had vanished. Even when they tried to laugh among themselves, the sound felt hollow, echoing in their own ears like a reminder of what they had done. They could not escape the truth, and they could not undo it. The frightening truth had been revealed, and now the shockwave carried on, reshaping not just Daniel's life, but the entire school. The cruel had lost their power, and the silent boy they mocked had become the voice that echoed in everyone's hearts. Without speaking a word, Daniel had changed everything, and for the bullies, that silence was more terrifying than any shout could ever be. The silence in the hallways did not last long. Soon, the whispers turned into action. The teachers, who had once overlooked the cruel games of the bullies, could no longer pretend they didn't know. The truth was out now, written on that medical card and carried on the lips of every student in the building. They had failed to protect Daniel, and the guilt pressed down on them too. One morning, the principal called Mark and his friends into the office. Their laughter had already disappeared days ago. But now their faces went pale as they sat in the stiff chairs, staring at the floor. The principal's voice was stern, colder than they had ever heard it. "You boys have crossed a line. You didn't just tease a student, you endangered his life." The words stung worse than any punishment because they carried the weight of truth. The punishments were heavy. Detentions, suspensions, meetings with their parents. Letters sent home that described their actions in detail. For once, they could not hide behind excuses. Their parents' disappointment was worse than anger. Mark's father stared at him across the dinner table, his voice low and sharp. "You could have killed that boy." Mark had no answer. The words stuck in his throat, burning like fire, at school. The consequences continued in ways no detention slip could measure. The bullies had lost the respect of their peers. Where once students followed them, now they avoided them. The cafeteria table where they sat was almost empty. Their voices drowned out by the silence of those who no longer laughed at their cruelty. They weren't leaders anymore, they were reminders. Every time someone looked at them, the memory of their actions returned, and the guilt grew heavier. Mark tried to shake it off, tried to act as if he didn't care. But when he saw Daniel in the hallways, calmly walking with his books, the guilt stabbed deeper. Daniel never said a word to him. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any insult Mark had ever thrown. It was a mirror, showing him the worst parts of himself. The other bullies felt it too. One of them, usually the loudest, now kept his head down, his laughter gone. Another stopped showing up to the cafeteria, eating his lunch in the library instead, unable to face the stairs. They had been kings of the school once, untouchable, feared. Now they were shadows, haunted by the boy they had tried to break. But Daniel didn't seek revenge. That was the part that made the consequences even heavier. He didn't mock them, didn't gloat, didn't look at them with hatred. He simply continued living, quiet and calm, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. His dignity was unbroken, and their power was gone. That contrast was unbearable. The students began to rally around Daniel, not with words, but with small actions. A girl who had once giggled at the bullies now handed him a pencil when his broke. A boy who had once looked away when Daniel was shoved now held the door open for him. These weren't acts of pity, they were acts of respect. A silent apology from those who had been too afraid to stand up before. The bullies watched all this, and the sting grew sharper. They had tried to make Daniel invisible, and instead, they had made him unforgettable. He didn't need to fight back. He had already won. And the price they paid was the loss of everything they once had: their pride, their power, their voices. At night, Mark lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. He remembered Daniel's eyes in the cafeteria, calm and unblinking. He remembered the sound of laughter dying in the hallway when the medical card was read. He remembered the silence afterward, heavy and suffocating. The truth haunted him, and he knew it always would. The consequences weren't just detentions or suspensions. The real consequence was living with what they had done, knowing they had come so close to pushing someone too far. It was a guilt that would never fully leave. A shadow that would follow them long after they left the school. For Daniel, life carried on. He still sat in his quiet corner, still drew in his notebook, still walked with steady steps. But the difference was clear. He was no longer a victim in the eyes of others. He was a survivor, and the bullies those who once thrived on. Cruelty were left to face the reality that their own actions, had destroyed their power. The frightening truth had broken them more completely than any punishment could. And Daniel, without ever raising his voice, had changed everything. Weeks passed, but the memory of what happened never faded. The school was quieter now, calmer, almost as if everyone was still holding their breath. Daniel walked through the halls as he always had, quiet, steady, with his books pressed against his chest, but the way people looked at him had changed forever. No one laughed at him anymore. No one mocked his clothes or whispered behind his back. Instead, they watched him with respect, and sometimes with shame, remembering all the times they had stayed silent when he needed someone to stand up. The bullies were no longer leaders of anything. Their laughter, once loud enough to fill a room, had been replaced with silence. They walked with their heads down, carrying the weight of their guilt wherever they went. The punishment from the school had stung. But the real punishment was something much deeper knowing. They had nearly destroyed a boy who had done nothing but endure in silence. That guilt clung to them, day after day, heavier than chains. But for Daniel, life began to shift in small, surprising ways. A teacher who had once overlooked him now asked him about his drawings. A classmate invited him to sit with their group at lunch. He didn't always say yes, he still liked his quiet corner, but he noticed the effort. It was as if the whole school had realized how badly they had failed him. And now they were trying to make up for it, little by little. Daniel's silence had once made him invisible. Now it made him unforgettable. He never raised his voice, never sought revenge. But his calm dignity had done what no shout, no fight, no rebellion could ever do, had exposed the truth. And the truth had changed everything. One afternoon, Mark found himself standing outside the art room, watching Daniel through the window. Daniel was sketching, his pencil moving quickly over the page, creating something only he could see. Mark hesitated, his throat tight. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. He wanted to apologize, to take back every cruel word, every shove, every laugh. But apologies seemed too small now, too weak against the damage that had been done. Daniel looked up for a moment and noticed Mark standing there. Their eyes met. There was no anger in Daniel's gaze, no hatred only, a calmness that unsettled Mark even more. It was the same look Daniel had given him that day in the cafeteria, the look that had stripped away his power. Mark looked down and walked away, knowing he would carry that silence for the rest of his life. For the other students, Daniel's story became a lesson. They whispered about it less now, not because they had forgotten, but because it had sunk deeper into their hearts. They had learned something that couldn't be taught in any classroom, that cruelty has consequences, and silence can hold more power than noise. They had seen what it meant to judge someone too quickly, to mistake dignity for weakness. And they would never forget it. The frightening truth wasn't just about Daniel's condition. It was about all of them, the way they had looked away, the way they had laughed, the way they had let cruelty live unchecked in their halls. And the lesson was simple. Respect costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. Years later, many of them would remember Daniel. They would remember the quiet boy who never fought back, who carried a dangerous secret with calm strength. They would remember how their laughter had died the moment the truth was revealed. And they would remember how one boy's silence had changed an entire school. Daniel never asked for that power. He never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted to be remembered as the boy with the heart condition. But that was the strange thing about truth. It had a way of reshaping everything. His silence had protected him. But it had also taught them all a lesson they would carry forever. The bullies never regained their old power. They grew quieter, humbler, marked by what they had done. Some tried to change, to be better. Others carried the guilt like a scar that wouldn't heal. But none of them ever forgot the boy they had mocked. The boy who could have been broken, but instead stood taller than all of them, without ever raising his voice. Daniel kept walking his path, calm and steady, his drawings tucked safely in his notebook. His silence wrapped around him like armor. He had never shouted, never fought back, never raised his fists. Yet he had won a battle larger than anyone could see, and the lesson remained echoing in the halls long after the laughter had stopped. Never judge the quiet ones. Never mistake silence for weakness. And never forget that behind every calm face there might be a truth strong enough to change everything.